the magnitude of these problems being very great, nonetheless, how often have even two or three come together to think over them? Let's look at the whether Heidegger is attempting to throttle the fates, to utterly obliterate their cosmos, or ordering their rhapsody. So Heidegger says not what's usually translated in the Parmenides poem as being, so not some form of a word like ėįnαι, or the words that are opposed to the words that are formed on the same basis as nous, or noein, or noesis, later noesis, but which is these things that which are translated as thinking, which corresponds to the nous and the noein and the noesis. But remembering that for Parmenides, the full range of interpretations which came later didn't yet exist. Instead, it was sort of he was full on in the thrush of the rhapsodies of the things sung by the rhapsodes. I mean, the chapters of the Iliad and Odyssey used to be called, in ancient times, they were called the rhapsodies, because it meant each of the chapters were supposed to be something that a rhapsode could perform in one sitting, and for nigh on 2,500 years or so before the time of the Pisistrati, they were indeed sung. We don't have the possibility of hearing them sung unless we have a keen ear for the ancient Greek. And I don't know that there are any rhapsodes living that do sing Iliad and Odyssey anymore. That's a good question. So from amidst this field where some form of the forms of the words which become of nous, like basically noein is being used to mean coming to awareness in so for instance in Odyssey it's said that, it's interesting to me, this is a very interesting point that I don't know, and it's enigmatic, is why is it Athena so powerful in Odyssey? Is this part of the thinking of the rise of Athens somehow already? And when did it come into did it come in only somehow in the Iron Age, or was it already there earlier in the Bronze Age, in the Archaic period? But Athena plays this role where she's guiding Odysseus, and when Odysseus, for instance, when Odysseus comes to light upon Ithaca, Athena is said to throw some mist. The word is somehow, I think it's just a sort of a confectionery in a way of maybe just of myself, I don't know, to notice that the word for mist is very similar to the name Hera, to Zeus's wife Hera, who's after all the goddess of marriage. And then in fact Odysseus is returning to Penelope after all these years, his lawful wife, but nonetheless I don't think that's probably what's meant, but maybe the rhapsode could sing that. But so what's interesting here is that what he's saying is the era, or the mists thrown down, or sort of shedded down like a dog's fur, or like a dandruff, or poured down in some translations. But I think it's sort of the word is open to all these translations. Poured down mists, which caused Odysseus' noose not to recognize that he was actually in his home of Ithaca, not to know it until through words spoken by a disguised Athena. Suddenly this noose came into operation, this noein. They don't have in Homer there's not the distinction between the noose as it were in Kant in terms of faculty and noein as its operation or something like that. It says more like the noein came to see that he was in. Then the noein was active, and then he knew that he was in Ithaca, and this from speech. It's also used of people with one thought within and putting on a different semblance. I'm not sure, but I suppose it's probably used in the first Rhapsody of Iliad, but it's certainly, I looked, and it's used in some passages with Odysseus' son having discussions with the goddess, and her saying, "Are you concealing this thing in your noose, or in your noetic processes?" Something like that. I mean, I'm making it sound artificial, but in any case, this inner and outer sense, as it were, if we want to call it that way, is there, and then plus the sense that noose is connected to truth, true vision, rather than being deceived as by Athena deceiving Odysseus. And all that is we can assume is in the semantic field, if you like, of Parmenides in his so-called didactic poem, or however it should be referred to. But Heidegger is saying here that nous and noein and all this are talking about, and in saying that nous and noein and this awareness, this recognition. So say for example the recognition of Odysseus that he's in Ithaca after being told by the god that he'd been deceived. And he thought, oh, the Phoenicians had misled me, and but then he realizes, no, this really is Ithaca. And so that's the noein, and then Parmenides is saying the noeō-ed and ἐฏι, or to be or being. I mean, one must analyze this famous passage and see how open it is to interpretation, and see if one has any special. What we would really want is somebody that really felt like they had they were keyed into it. They had a sensibility of it, just as a musician has a sensibility for music. Somebody could have a sensibility for how this word is being used, and then they could pass a sensible opinion about how to translate or interpret this passage. Since obviously we don't exist at the time of Parmenides, we don't really know what the word is like, just as we don't really know what even Bildung, which were so, as it were, with the sort of persistent pretension, couch in the in simple language of, Bildung is this thing that Humboldt wanted, and it's better than our current education, and it was really a kind of allowing of each of the students to follow their bliss or something. I sort of exaggerated in order to with the Campbell quote, but that's sort of how Bildung seems to us, something that's supposedly superior to the current Bildung, or to the current education. And thus the Paideia even more sketchy on how we actually understand it. But in order to say whatever Parmenides was saying, it's not that simply that you memorize these words, like that noein should be translated as thinking, and ėįnαι as to be or something, and then you immediately understand what they're talking about. You could be, in the modern sense, fully fluent in ancient Greek and understand absolutely nothing that you're hearing, because you just translate it into modern terms, and then therefore you the language wouldn't speak to you in the same way. It wouldn't be the same thing. So Heidegger is saying here, this which we're calling being isn't actually the question of being. He's saying, if we want to get to the question of being with regard to Parmenides, for Parmenides, what being was the Moira, the fate, that which has governance over the gods and men. And likewise, Heidegger says the word for being in the sense that it's come down to us, for instance, in Kant, with this lengthy question of whether being, I mean, it's the common thing to say is, oh, Kant has denied being is a predicate, and therefore, and said being is only the copula the sentence in the critique of Rein and Vernunft, and therefore he's dismissed it, and Nietzsche could then step in and say these last disappearing vapors with the Catholics regard it as genus supremum or something like that, undefinable super genus, and therefore there's nothing more to be said. Actually, Kant did say all that, but it's like the truth without the whole truth, and the whole truth totally changes the complexion, which is that Kant said that the being isn't a real predicate, but it's a logical predicate. So now we're pointing towards logical positivism even. But let's forget about all that. But I'm just to say that Moira, Heidegger says, is sort of like this being of beings, and what Parmenides is calling being and saying it's the same as thought is rather what Heidegger is calling anwesen, or presencing, being understood as presence. So what the Greeks called being was presencing, and presencing is, according to Parmenides, the same as when Odysseus, who was under the misapprehension that he had been misled by the Phoenicians and on some God-forsaken spot, Theoi-forsaken spot, inhospitable, cold, was actually, suddenly he comes aware that he's in Ithaca, and that's the presencing of Ithaca to him. And Heidegger saying, no, that's not what he means by being, and that's not really what the word being means. In other words, he's saying, really, that's not what the word being means, just in the same way that Aristotle is saying there's lots of ways the word physis is being used, but there's one that really makes sense and is the core meaning. Heidegger is saying there's one sense of sein, which is really the core meaning, which we should discover here, as though it were always there. The question of whether it's always there is sort of, I suppose we should mention here that Heidegger is saying not something always there in the sense of a cosmos set up like an ordering, or a constitution even. Herodotus says the Spartans who had no written constitution, but whose constitution was passed on by man to man through training. This constitution was called the cosmos. But Heidegger's saying that's like an ergon. That's like what he's calling werk, or a work. When in the work of art, for instance, in his essay on the work of art. And Heidegger says, with respect to Heidegger as a whole, Heidegger taking as a rubric over all his 100 and so on works, that Vega nicht Werke, or ways, not work. So he rules out this being of being sense of work. So in a sense, he's saying the Moira were at work for the ancient Greeks. They stood over the gods or the theoi and over mortals. And then he's saying, and this concept of being a being is at work in many ways in the tradition, according to Heidegger, in the notion of necessity, and Anaximander, for instance, is another version. Energia in Aristotle is another version. Saying these are all because of the actus purus, I suppose, would be the highest way of stating that. The characteristics of theos taken as the being of beings, taken as this thing that only quod impossibile est, could one say there is no God, according to Thomas in his disputations on the truth, and only then could one say the truth only exists when man exists. But so this Heidegger is challenging this whole field of the theory of the being of beings. And then he's saying, here's Nietzsche, who is focused on Moira, especially in his Götterdämmerung, and who has said Moira is sort of standing in this zone where the titanic forces are raging, and the Greeks invent Apollo, as it were, and Apollo ushers out with this beautiful, blithe world with the nectar drinking gods and their constant orgy of bliss, and their abiding and stable orgy on Olympus. And say these Olympian, these Homeric shades must fall back into the Dionysian chaos within the glance of the Moria, or the Fates. And then, so it's sort of like there's a plausible way we could look at this Götterdämmerung and connect it up to Nietzsche's, the way Nietzsche positions eternal recurrence of the same as being one of these highest values. I mean, it's really only through Nietzsche that the idea of, this is the thing of Strauss is talking about all the time. This is a big subject of Strauss and the Straussians, is only through, and it could be richly documented. And Schmidt has written something interesting about how the word, value has come in, associated with money, associated with the theater production, which is sort of a Strauss sometimes half ridicules as a theatrical term, production, the economic term, but that the worth, as the worth of human beings is swapped out for this vert, or the value of things in modernity. And Nietzsche played a considerable role in that, although it was already, I believe it was basically happened because of Spinoza and the isthmus straight, or the pantheismus straight, and then that was already part of the educational reforms of Schleiermacher, and maybe it goes back to 1848 or something like that. But nonetheless, Nietzsche, in thematizing it in a new way, in thematizing values as against phenomena, and values as against Tatsache, or facts, had created a new presentation, which was then turned into the current fact-value distinction, or fact-norm distinction, by Simmel in his enlightening to the moral Wissenschaft, about right around a few years before 1900, maybe a year before Strauss was born, I would say, even. And this has come to power in the American universities, surely. Although it has this funny thing where it's fight still. The reason why it's so confusing is because the law schools, because the law schools who don't really don't care that much about how their whole technical apparatus, how their technicians have originally. I mean, there's a few guys like Richard Epstein who's talking about Roman law and stuff like that, but on the whole, they don't care that much. They just want to produce technicians, legal technicians who can function. So these questions aren't raised, but nonetheless, they have in some way a different basis of thinking mixed in, which is prior to the fact-norm distinction, and then the fact-norm distinction charges in through the Supreme Court cases, especially in the 60s, and then you have all these conflicts which are sort of fought out on a darkling plane without full realization of what's happening. But okay, then here's this question: is Heidegger merely looking on from the perspective of his artificial schema, his cosmos as it actually happens, and saying, oh look, Nietzsche is one of these all too ontic guys. He's failed to achieve the real question of being. He's failed to see that there are all these versions of the beings of beings, as a super being, the Moira, the ideas, energy, necessity, Kantian versions, and Hegelian absolute. I'm not sure that Hegelian absolute can be just thrown in with that list, but I'm saying something like that. I mean, whether Heidegger actually says that, but he says of Nietzsche, rather, he says, yeah, maybe Nietzsche has smashed this, has overcome this being a beings version, but it's not all that clear whether he's doing the thing. I mean, one way to just say that's kind of a dodge it's kind of a dodge, but it's kind of helpful. It's a dodge in that you mislead yourself into thinking you're actually thinking something, but it's helpful in that maybe you actually could open up a window is by saying whatever it is that comes after philosophy, which is often said of Marx in connection to overturning Hegel and going towards that was the guy that said, you are what you eat. Man ist, was man ist. Said, but in any case, going towards the new materialism. Is Heidegger, I mean, maybe this is the question that Nietzsche is on his tightrope, playing simultaneously the trickster, but also awakening something deeper. And then if Heidegger knows that he has to engage with this, has to face up to it, is Nietzsche saying, and when Heidegger says, Nietzsche hat mich kaputt gemacht, Nietzsche has defeated me, broken me, is it because Nietzsche's laughing, saying, look, Heidegger has just set up one more being a being scheme, so one more super scheme, and then, in the light of this, that Heidegger's saying of Nietzsche, basically Nietzsche has seen and seen correctly that Kant, in distinguishing in his whole attempt to go from the phenomena to the noumena, is repeating the Platonic system, and therefore repeating one of these being a being operations, as it were, which we're trying to overcome with the Vega, not the setting up the ergon as a system, or setting up the ergon as even as a Spartan constitution, as a cosmos. Is Nietzsche? I mean, you see how there's a kind of a war there. Maybe is Nietzsche right, or is Heidegger right? Which one is overthrowing the other properly?